Hello everybody, welcome to Snyder's Inc. It is goddamn hot as hell where I'm living right now. I can't get AC at the moment, so yeah, you're gonna might hear complain about that during this video. But we got another Mr. Ballen one. This one's called the Russian Death March. We'll get right into this. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, comment what you think down below. Let's get right into this right now. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go.
Today's story is about an event that was so horrifying, the one person who survived it couldn't speak when she finally stumbled, bloody and terrified, out of the forest. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please send the like button on a blind date with Karen to a restaurant that has less than perfect service and no manager on duty. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.
I think I'm gonna do some reaction to Karen videos. I think you might see them on the channel coming soon.
Alright, let's get into today's story. By 1993, Lyudmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed.
Yeah, that's probably something they have a right to criticize her over. Like, yeah, don't put your students in unnecessary situations if they have no reason to be. Like, who the heck is that benefit? You gotta just let them, you gotta teach them and let them do their own shit. Don't freaking push them over the edge. What the hell?
Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp, she was very motherly and tender and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Lyudmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life. In the summer of 1993, Lyudmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Hamar Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Lyudmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child.
Interesting. I wonder what led up to the situation where she ended up looking after him, because if she's not his child, that means, well, I wonder what happened to his actual parents. Were they just not around? Were they not just not there? Did something happen to them? What happened to lead to that situation?
And he looked at Lyudmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students, and he would function more like an assistant to Lyudmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Dennis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group.
Oh, so Valentina is the living one who can barely speak at the moment. So, or couldn't speak when she came out of the forest. So now we get to find out what happened to this group. What did they go through? We're literally about to find out right now.
Up on Hamar Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Lyudmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Hamar Daban mountain range. The Hamar Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation, and in the summertime you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Lyudmila and her group's multi-day hike hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Ludmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over this stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass, before ultimately reaching the Hamar Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Hamar Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the...
That sounds like way more easy than I would think it is, to have a situation where only one survives. Like, what happened to this group? What the hell happened? I want to know.
The only group making this particular movement towards Hamar Daban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be two other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in. So Ludmila and her 6 students stayed the night in Marino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful, they're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely miserable.
Oh no, so the forecast people were wrong, and it's the day. And now that they probably came unprepared for bad weather, they probably weren't prepared for that. So because they weren't prepared, they don't know what to do probably with that part. Oh no. Oh no. What's gonna happen? Oh man, what's gonna happen with these guys?
This treacherous weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro, and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this, and so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward.
Interesting that she's like, listen, bad weather happens, but we just need to keep going. You can't stop now. We can't get sad and all that now. So it's so interesting that she's trying to use the bad weather. She's still trying to be positive while the bad weather's happening, while the whole thing's been screwed up. She's still trying to be a positive influence. That is very interesting. That's the way that's gone. It's very interesting.
And not play a victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. You know, they believed in Ludmila, and she's telling them to keep going, so they kept going. By the evening of August 4th, so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain, where there is no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery, and she always led by example, and they saw her, right out in front leading the charge up towards the Hamar Daban Ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she turned around and told them, we're taking a break. And in fact, we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here. No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. On the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow. That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here, we'll make do.
Oh, so that is possible. She looked at them and they just, like, no matter how much they tried to hide it, they looked like they were just done. They was calling it out, they were going home. And because they thought she saw this and that's what she thought that's what they were thinking, she's like, okay, let's just call it here. We'll go home. We'll call it here. We'll camp out for the night, is what I mean. And we could just do it tomorrow when all the thing is gone. Even though it may not be the best situation, but at least you guys can take that break.
Others have said her map may not have been very accurate, and so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we got to stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realize. And she thought they can't make the 2.5 mile journey. We're going to have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal, and then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain, and so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent and soaked their sleeping bags. And they were able to go outside and they put the stakes back down in the ground, but they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But
yeah, this is getting bad for them physically because they could get really sick from this and all that. So this could get really, really bad. And this is a very scary situation for them to be in right now. This is a very scary situation.
they were able to eventually fall asleep, and at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything is frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory, and if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right. They got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said, we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule. And it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the Hamar-Daban mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down, it's this beautiful morning, and they're looking up at the mountains all around them, the leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head, and he has to do a double take, because there is this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood, and she's not doing anything, she's just standing there. And at first he actually thought, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person, there's something wrong with this person. But very quickly the group realized, like, we cannot abandon this girl. This is a young girl who should not be out here. I don't know what she's doing out here.
Oh gosh, this young girl, I think her name was Valentina, I think, if it's correct. I might be wrong. I'll find out in the video. Is the one that's standing there expressionless, covered in blood, which makes you wonder, what did she witness? Or what happened going back down that mountain that led to literally everyone pretty much dying except for her in this group? What happened?
And so they turned around and they went on shore and they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting. And they tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her, and she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that this girl needs help, and they had blankets, and so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks, and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl. She's covered in blood, walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her, and although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old. Her name was Valentina Yotachenko.
It was Valentina. All right, I got my name right. I remember it well. Okay, good.
And that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the Hamar Daban Ridge. And then she paused, and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned. Valentina goes out there and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest and we need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? And so Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up. And
okay, so we have that confirmation that part happened. Okay, so what happened after that?
And everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line and they start walking down the mountain. They had only made it about 10 meters into their descent when Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls. And the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time, when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth, and then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila...
What the hell? What happened that caused that? What? Was it... Did he get, did hypothermia do that to him? Did he get, really some type of bad sickness because of how bad the conditions were? What happened that led to that situation, to that happening to him? What? That's just one. There were about a 7-person group. There's 5 more apparently that die here. God damn, what's the other situations?
Mila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart, and then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, he's dead. The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on? Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha, and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now?
Well, that probably concerns for them, because if this guy who's the most physically fit one of them a few minutes ago was fine and now is just dead, their brain has to think, am I okay? Am I about to die? Like, your brain will start panicking at something like that happening. Oh, yeah.
And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire. And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, no, go down to the forest and start a fire. And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain. And they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, I can't move. And they turn around, and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. And she's heaving like something's going on inside of her. And then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha. And she dies right in front of them. And now...
What the hell is causing all these people to die? What? My brain can't even figure this out. What's going on?
Now the group is in hysterics, and Valentina's in the front, and she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around, and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth, and some of them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned, and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground.
Why is she not feeling this way, though? Why is she okay? That's weird. Why is she okay? That's what's interesting. What is going on?
Just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand, and she pulls her hand back, and then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode, and so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her, and he's saying, okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there. And so Valentina says, okay. She makes her way up to her bag. She gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items, and when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head, and she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone,
she just, in about the span of a few minutes, just watched all of her group die. So her brain's gotta be in freaking panic mode right now. She's gotta be trying to figure out, how the heck am I still alive? Why am I still alive? What's going on? She's gotta be worried as shit. She's gotta have her brain probably cause a thing. She's gotta be losing it right now. I can't imagine what would be going on in the head as I'm witnessing this. I can't imagine.
she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain and she goes into the forest and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there and the storm picked up dramatically and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm going to get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up, and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids. And then she says her goodbye, and then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest, where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually, she does hear voices.
That makes sense. 4 days in there. I'd be stuck in a fort by myself. I'd be expecting to die too, in fairness. So that makes sense. That adds up. You would expect that. Your brain would think that. If everyone else is dying around you, you would expect you're going to die too. So that makes sense.
And she starts making her way towards where they're coming from, and that's when she gets to the river and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers, who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor, as well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice, and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened, and the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia.
What if someone in that group poisoned the others and Valentina just happened to not get poisoned? I'm not saying Valentina poisoned them because she's so shocked by killing them that she's in actual shock and can barely speak. Then no, I don't think she would plan that, because she wouldn't be able to play that good of actor, I would guess. But what if she poisoned... What if someone planned to poison 6 people and they be the only survivors, and it just so happened that they end up getting poisoned themselves? That's just a theory I'm throwing out. I mean, Valentina might poison them too, but I'm trying to come up with an explanation as to why it would happen like that.
Yeah, and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. And they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision: stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Hamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face. Either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain, where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers, who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability, decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes, not wearing jackets, not wearing pants. They're basically in underwear. And they calmly walked down the mountain, all the way down to the forest. And once they got down there, 2 of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches.
Why? Why? What? What is going on in these mountains in Russia that is causing these guys to think so ridiculously stupid? What is going on in Russia, man? We've now had 2 situations and where Russia just leads to weird choices and dumb decisions. I don't know what's causing this one, obviously. Unlike the military one where everyone's just idiots. I don't know what's going on here, but this, it's just weird. What is going on in Russia?
And so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all, and they were found deceased lying around this fire. The 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas, one that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche. Except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened, and they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So what do you think? Is there a connection between Hamar Daban and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened to both groups that we don't know about? Or are they unrelated, and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize? So that's going to do it.
I don't think they can, they're connected in the way where they cause people to do weird choices and do weird things. But they're not connected because every choice that happened to the group I was talking about here was done by themselves. Every injury, every pain. While the other one had injuries and that going on that looked like they probably wouldn't be caused by something else. So I don't think they're connected in how some of them died. They're connected though in the way that something made them change their attitude and made them not think clearly. So that's what I gotta say when it comes to that. Thank you everybody for watching this reaction video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, comment what you think down below. Again, thank you all for watching. I will see you for the next one.